Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Jason Kander is an activist, a politician, and a veteran. A former Secretary of State of Missouri, in 2018, he dropped out of a promising mayoral campaign after announcing that he needed to address untreated PTSD from his time serving as an Army captain in Afghanistan. After 8 months out of the public eye, he founded Let America Vote to end voter suppression, and he served as a teaching fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics. He's been on CNN as a commentator and every other network, but he now runs the Veterans Community Project, a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to fighting veteran suicide and veteran homelessness. Jason is also the author of the best-selling book, Outside the Wire, and host of the popular political podcast, Majority 54. In his downtime, he coaches his son's baseball team, and we are here today to talk about his incredible book called Invisible Storm, a soldier's memoir of politics and PTSD. Welcome to the broadcast, Jason Kander.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So before we get to the book, I would be remiss, since I'm sitting with someone who was actually going to run for president, and many people had prayed and hoped that you would. We're going to talk about why you took a different path. But just since we are close to the midterms, I would just love to put you on the spot and just get your initial reaction to what you think it tells us.
Well, my initial reaction was that it was a giant relief because I thought we were going to get trounced. And the more we find out about the results of the election, the more it turns out that I think we narrowly won. We didn't, like, we being the Democrats, didn't just avoid getting beat. We're now +1 in governor's races. We've taken back some state legislatures during this cycle. We won all of the swing state Secretary of State races where the opponents were election deniers. We are +1 in the U.S. Senate. We are going to end up narrowly losing the House, but we're going to lose the districts that we were never supposed to win in the first place, that we really were supposed to lose last time, and that's it. Even picked up a few seats, turned a few seats red to blue.
What happened? Why do you think it surprised everyone? I mean, this was obviously not at all what the pundits predicted.
Yeah, I think two things happened. One, I think that Republicans massively underestimated the degree to which women and other Americans are not cool with the idea of women being forced to give birth. Not a popular idea. I think it really, not only was that an issue upon which a lot of people voted, I think it also really crystallized, particularly for independent voters who may not have had it at the front of their mind, just how authoritarian and extreme the Republican Party, or at least its politicians, have become, which leads me to the second thing that happened, which is I think democracy has been at risk and has really been in retreat for almost a decade now because of voter suppression. I feel like this is the election cycle where people really stop taking it for granted at a large degree. And I think you can see that in the way Generation Z and the millennial generation turned out. There was a real element of, wait a minute, this really could go away. And if we don't turn out here, that really might be the end game. And I think it would have been. And so I think that's basically what it was. I think, back against the wall, people went, yeah, we're not actually going to let that happen.
Yeah. Beautifully put. Your book opens actually in a hospital, and you are on suicide watch. I want to, just before we get to how you got there, the decision to go to such a personal place, was that a difficult calculus for you in writing this book?
Oh, you mean to tell everybody all this stuff that you usually wouldn't tell people? Yeah, it was, but to some extent, after I had already spoken publicly or, announced publicly why I was stepping back from public life in October of 2018, that a little bit sort of broke the seal for me, because it was like, once you've already told people that you had suicidal thoughts and struggled with depression and PTSD, or PTSD and then depression as a result of your PTSD, and the suicidal thoughts as a result of the depression. You know, it's just a little easy. It's like anything else. Once you start it, the rest of it gets a little bit easier. Once you do it once, it gets a little bit easier. But actually, I think what a bigger factor was the way people reacted to that initial announcement, which I didn't expect. I mean, to be honest, like I thought that by saying why I was stepping back, I could maybe do some good to help some other people choose to go get help. But I really thought that was it for me. Like I pretty much thought I would be, you know, sort of going off into obscurity because what I did for a living at that time was I was a politician, and we have a pretty reliable pattern in our history as a country of when people who are in the political world are even suspected of having mental health problems. There's like no place for them. So I had no reason to think that anything else would happen with me. I just thought I was kind of falling on that grenade.
And before we get to the incredible outpouring you got in response, I just remember the scene in your book where are you with Abe, your aide, and you're kind of about to push that button. I don't know if it was a tweet or you were going to send something out
it was an email,
to a huge mailing list. But do you remember that moment of like, I'm actually doing this right now? Like, what was that like?
Oh, it was terrible. It was my lowest point career-wise and personally, really. I mean, you know, it was announced. I felt like I was announcing to the world that I had failed. And keep in mind that when you are at a certain level politically, it's not unlike being like a medium-sized business owner, you know, in the sense that you feel, and I don't say a big business owner or a small business owner, because just like a small business owner, you have these people who count on you to make payroll and everything, but it's a medium size, it's bigger than that, because there's literally the people who, you know, you employ, who count on you to persist and continue on, and you don't want to disappoint. But then there's all the other people, you know, tens of thousands who have really put a great deal of hope in you. And more than anything at that moment, I just felt like I was failing and letting down all of those people. But the response,
did the response kind of just, was it instantaneous?
It probably was, but I didn't entirely know it, because I had decided to kind of wall myself off from the response, because the one thing I had figured out clinically about myself, and there wasn't much, was that I had been using, you know, the public adulation and media attention and that kind of thing as a coping mechanism for what, and that was the one thing I knew. And so I had decided all on my own before I even started therapy that I was going to detox from that. So I had Abe and my wife, Diana, and the folks around me sort of helping me by keeping me in a bubble and not, you know, I was trying to just focus on what was right in front of me and not think about the reaction. But it was also it was impossible to not have some sense of it. I mean, like when I know Abe is fending off supportive phone calls, which I appreciate, but I just wasn't taking, from Nancy Pelosi and, you know, you name it. I mean, like, and I was vaguely aware that people were talking about it. I did not find out till many days later that it was like the number one, like to some extent, international story. So yeah, the response was immediate, but for me, it felt like it was more like a few days later.
And for those who don't know exactly how meteoric your star was at the time, and I'm not saying that's over, but just to give a snapshot, when you met with Obama, he told you, you have what I have, you're a natural. There really was just a lot of buzz about your political future. And I think a kind of relief that Democrats particularly felt that here was someone they could, you know, pin their hopes on, their future on. I know you talked about the weight of that, but I can't imagine, as someone who's fairly type A myself, what it's like to walk away from that potential, at least, you know, at the time when it's kind of gathering the most steam.
Yeah. You know, the thing about that is like, it was difficult to walk away from it, which is why it took me a really long time to do it. Because to the outside world, it felt like I had just, boom, on a dime, been like, I'm done. But I'd been deteriorating for a very long time. And it was, for me, it was more like, I can't go any farther. Like, it was just like, for me, the decision was not, do I continue with my career or not? Like, do I go to therapy or do I continue with my career? For me, the decision was much more like, do I risk my own safety because I'm having these, more frequent suicidal ideations? And it was really the decision of, I don't want to live like this anymore. And, stepping back from public life for me it was a package deal. It was part of it. So for me, in a weird way, I sort of look at it as a much more simple decision, because it was more like, to me, it was more like I was, running a really long race, and people think that I was like Forrest Gump, and I just stopped at one point. It was like, I think I'm done now. But what they don't realize is it was more like I was running just as long as Forrest Gump, and then one day I collapsed and I just couldn't keep going. And the difficult decision was just deciding to tell people why. So that's really how it was for me.
Yeah. And just what you capture so well, and I think in a way it's a first, at least as far as I've seen it, is how corrosive this disease can be. And it feels like one. It's like a demon that enters you and takes over. And even when you can rationalize have rational moments about it, it's winning. It's essentially running the show. Can you just give us a window into kind of, for those who just don't understand what PTSD feels like, how in a way it is, I think the organizing kind of energy of one's life, once it takes hold? Yeah.
It's a really hard thing to describe. There's a section in the book where I try to describe it in terms of what it feels like. And what it feels like is, when you are like you're in the other room and you hear, and your spouse is like cleaning the garage or something, and then you hear something enormous crash in the garage, and then you don't hear anything else, and in your mind you think your spouse is like broken their neck or something, and you run toward the garage, like that feeling of dread. But it's not so much that's a lot of the time, but really what it is after you get to the garage and you see that everything is okay, and then you can't help but imagine what it would have been like. And as you imagine what it would have been like if things were as bad as you thought, you're sort of filled with this uncontrollable sense of dread. So having at least the hypervigilance part of like just one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress is, it's like all the time having some level of stress, like what you're having when you're on your way to the garage. And then, but just as much of the time having that sense that if that thing didn't happen, it's bound to happen. And you have to constantly be protecting from it and controlling the situation. That's what it felt like to me. And then combined with, not being able to sleep because of night terrors, which really just creates a great deal of exhaustion. And so I felt exhausted all the time. And then because all of that was so frustrating, and because I was lacking sleep, I came to a point where I got pretty depressed. And in particular, I felt a lot of shame and self-loathing, because and this is kind of weird and unique to me, I think, while my self-confidence continued to go like this the whole time, like based on the way my parents raised me, I guess, a good Jewish sort of your God's gift sort of upbringing. I, at no point did I in any way flag in my belief that I was the most talented politician in the country. Like I believed it until, to be honest, I still believe it. It's just, and I'm not saying it's a rational belief. I'm just saying that's what's in there. I believe that. I'm not saying it's backed up by evidence. It's just, that's what my brain believes. But at the same time, what PTSD did is it also made my self-esteem go the opposite direction. So over time, it made me believe that while I was the most talented and had the greatest abilities, I was also an irredeemable human. Like I had not done enough for my country. I had not done enough in the military. I felt like a fraud and I was ashamed. And so what I was doing for a long time was using the rising self-confidence as a balance or a salve to the self-esteem. And that just, only lasted so long.
And one of those scenes that you have about what you did go through in Afghanistan, so much of what you're replaying is how bad it could have been when you were alone in a situation with your translator, when you were in a car with someone who seemed to be taking you in the wrong direction. You paint those scenes, and the terror is very relatable, but it's almost like you feel like you haven't earned the PTSD because you weren't wounded or, stepping on a landmine. Or so, just if you help us understand kind of, is that something that's typical now that so many who have gone through this, that part of the PTSD is that I haven't earned the right to be traumatized?
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a big part of why I and a lot of others resist treatment. I think that there's a common misconception, particularly about veterans, and particularly about male veterans, and maybe males generally, but I think it's just a common misconception about trauma in this country that when people resist going to get therapy, people who need it, that it's this sense that they think it's weak, and that, but I never thought that. Like I never looked at anybody who went to get therapy and thought they were weak. It was different for me. I believed that if I claimed the mantle of PTSD, that I was stealing valor because I didn't believe I had done enough. And there's really no greater sin in the military than stealing valor. Maybe the only thing that would be worse is like sedition or treason or, even
I want to make
desertion.
sure I'm hearing. Did you say, Jason, it's stealing valor?
Yeah. So stealing valor is like a textbook definition would be like somebody who wears a Purple Heart medal despite not having been awarded one, right? So that's like the textbook definition. But like basically stolen valor is anytime you claim to have done something that you didn't do in the military. And so to me, I felt like it was stealing valor for me to accept a diagnosis or even consider one of PTSD, because in the military, and this is really common. I mean, the more I talk about this, the more everybody says they feel this way. You're told from the moment, at least in the Army, you're sort of led to believe from the moment you come in that whatever you're doing is not that big of a deal compared to what other people are doing. I don't actually fault that indoctrination, because for me to keep going into meetings with people who might be setting up a trap to kill me and to keep doing my job as an intelligence officer, I had to believe that. Just like my buddy Steven had to believe that what he was doing was no big deal compared to somebody else for him to go back out on patrol after getting shot at the day before, right? So that's the nature of the work. The problem is when you finish your deployment or when you finish your service, nobody disabuses you of that notion. So instead of it being a matter of like, well, it's weak for me to go get help, it's much more like, I have it on good authority that what I did was no big deal, so it can't count as traumatic. So this can't be PTSD. So if I were to treat it like PTSD, that'd be like stealing valor. And that's what really drove me away from getting treatment. And it's also, I think you're right, played a large role in me feeling a lot of guilt about my service and feeling it was inadequate.
It's very powerful that Diana, your wife, is running through this book. And that was obviously a decision just structurally to have her voice in it, kind of not equally with yours, but alternating with yours. And I was really struck by how someone you live with can absorb the PTSD. I didn't realize that in a way, whether it's by osmosis or experience, when you have someone who's having night terrors and is convinced that you might be dead if they don't hear from you, or that your kid might be in trouble when they simply go to summer camp, that it can, in a way, be absorbed or adopted by your spouse or partner. Can you just explain a little bit of that and your decision to have Diana's voice in here, which was very effective?
Yeah, we didn't know about secondary post-traumatic stress either. I mean, I didn't even find out about it until I started therapy, and my therapist suggested that maybe Diana should see somebody too. It's. I want to be clear. It's not like, because sometimes when I say like PTSD can be contagious, I worry that people are like, well, I don't want to like hire somebody. I don't want to be around. No, it's like if you live with somebody, if like your loved one, your spouse, or your parent or somebody like that, you can end up adopting some of the symptoms without having the underlying trauma. So like Diana didn't go with me to Afghanistan, but when you have me in the house, waking up in the middle of the night with these night terrors and then telling you about them, and then, during the day, constantly, trying to control the situation and convincing you that we're in, danger, the world is a dangerous place, it seeps into you. And so that's what happened. So yes, she had to go and get her own version of treatment. We wanted to put that in the book for a couple of reasons. One, and I thought it was very brave of Diana, because she hadn't broken the seal. Like when I made my announcement, nobody knew that she had struggled to. She didn't have to do that. She's got her own very, public and very successful career. So she didn't need to do that, but she wanted to do that to be helpful to others as well. So it was important to put her journey in the book as well. I also thought it was important because one of the best devices and most challenging devices in writing the book is that as you read it chronologically, as you go along, I, as the narrator, only avail myself of the language, the lexicon of explaining how I was feeling that was available to me at the time in the story when I'm explaining it to you. So like, I don't use terms like hypervigilance that I learned in therapy until my therapist in the story teaches me the term, because I needed people to be able to relate to it, whether they'd gone and gotten help or not. I needed to put them in my shoes and see what I was thinking. The shortcoming of that is that you are then, by its very nature, getting a warped perspective. You're getting the perspective of somebody who, at the time that they're providing it, really doesn't understand what's going on with them. So it was really important to have that other perspective, that other occasional narrator to come in and say what they were seeing. And then finally, because I'm not the only best-selling author in our marriage, and it just made sense to have this other tremendous writer be part of the story.
And I'm just going to say candidly, there were times I thought, how is she staying? How is she staying the course? And it just never seemed questioned. I mean, you have an incredible romance and partnership, and that's part of this book, and it comes through just the incredible intellectual partnership in addition to the romantic one. But was there a time where she kind of like, I don't know if I can do this?
Oh yeah, sure. Like plenty of times. I just never believed it. There was, it wasn't until really later after I started to get help that I realized like how close she probably was to feeling like she needed to leave. And that's because it wasn't until I started to get help that I realized, how difficult I had been to live with. I mean, until I started to see the situation more clearly, I felt like I didn't feel like I was unbearable. I felt like I was married to a really difficult person. So it was a big twist for me to learn that like the call was coming from inside my head. It was like, It was me, not her.
And you were very honest about your own hubris that is kind of ingrained in you. Many of us who were raised by Jewish parents who tell us that like we're the cat's meow. But it does feel like you had a lot of accolades early, a lot of awards, affirmation, and that it just drove you in a way to a crazy pace. Like it just came through just on all of these campaigns, or even when you're in law school or any of it. It's just you're just always at warp speed. And how can anyone sustain that? And I don't think that the lesson of this book is that you shouldn't work hard, but it does feel like you're telling us in a way to kind of slow down a little bit, and that it's a marathon, not a sprint. I mean, how do you, when you look back just on your childhood pace and intensity, how does that sit with you?
In the period before I deployed, I think I was just a regular, very driven person. My dad raising me had used, he was my baseball coach, and he had used baseball to teach me about the value of putting a lot into something. And that's how you can feel like you get a lot back. Like that, throw yourself into things, be passionate. My mom taught me that too. And so that's what I did. Like whether it was high school baseball, high school debate, whatever, I threw myself into things. And that made me much more often successful at those things. And I enjoyed that. I'm a naturally very driven person. The difference is that after I deployed, what I didn't understand was happening was that I had all these intrusive thoughts and disruptive memories that I was actively trying to avoid and outrun. And so that that ability I had to stay driven, to stay busy, to outwork anyone became my coping mechanism. So like, I try and make sure to get across in the book that like, I don't feel I'm any different than somebody who turned to substance. It's just that I had a substance right in front of me in my career. I had, this hard charging political career and these opportunities to feel these regular endorphin hits. And that's what I glommed onto, and it became how I avoided myself. And then on top of that, I developed this idea, this sort of redemption myth, that if I achieved enough, if I achieved this next thing, that would make me feel better, not feel fraudulent, feel, like maybe I liked myself, but it never happened, no matter what I achieved.
I just want to go back to this.
I guess what I would say is, you're right. To me, the lesson is not don't work hard, because I still work very hard. I don't work as hard as I did then, because that was unsustainable. But the lesson is work hard for the right reason. And I still think a lot of it was the right reason, but the frenetic pace. Yeah.
In 2016, you made a lot of news with a particular campaign ad against Roy Blunt for the Senate. Can you just tell us how that ad came about? Was that entirely your idea? And just for those who don't remember what you did, just give us a quick recap. Yeah.
So in 2016, when I ran for the U.S. Senate, I had an F rating, proudly, from the NRA, and the NRA spent a lot of money making sure that Missourians knew that, and like a lot of money. And so at one point, I said to my media guy and my campaign manager, so Abe, and then this guy Mark Putnam, who was our media guy, I just kind of offhandedly said, well, I bet I could assemble a rifle a lot faster than the other guy. And then the media guy, Mark, he was like, do you think you could do it blindfolded? And I said, well, I never have, but yeah, probably. Like, we used to have to clean our rifle in the dark a lot, like in the woods. And so that's when we came up with the idea. And so what we made was a 30-second ad where there's no music or anything, and it's all one shot. And it's just me standing there talking about why I support, gun safety measures, why I supported, in that case, background checks in particular, while assembling an AR-15, which is basically the same rifle that I used overseas, blindfolded. And so really the ad was like a muscular argument for gun regulation. It was really me saying, like, yes, I have an F rating from the NRA, is basically what I was saying, because I know what the heck I'm talking about.
Right. And it just was damn cool, I got to tell you.
Yeah.
I'm Jason Kander, and Senator Blunt has been attacking me on guns. Well, in the Army, I learned how to use and respect my rifle. In Afghanistan, I'd volunteer to be an extra gun in a convoy of unarmored SUVs. And in the state legislature, I supported Second Amendment rights. I also believe in background checks so that terrorists can't get their hands on one of these. I approve this message because I'd like to see Senator Blunt do this.
A final question is this. Politico said about you, to hear Democrats from Barack Obama on down tell it, Kander is the future of the party. Young, energetic, and insistently progressive lawyer from a red state, a devoutly anti-Trump military veteran. What they don't say is, and a Jew. And I just want to leave, because this audience is going to be particularly interested. We haven't had a Jewish president. And I'm just wondering, as someone who was deeply inside the political machine and had all of these folks getting very excited about what you could be and do in America, do you think it's possible? Do you think that the roadblocks still exist, and particularly in this anti-Semitic moment? Just give us your take on maybe an America that has a Jew at the helm.
Yeah, look, I think it's totally possible. That said, I am concerned about I'm very concerned about rising anti-Semitism, because I don't think it's something that happens slowly, right? I mean, I've been pretty outspoken about it recently, because I feel like it is something you have to aggressively speak out against, because if we look at how quickly things seep into public opinion in this country right now, it ain't that much of a stretch, right? To get the base of the Republican Party, particularly the evangelical base, to get them to an anti-Semitic place. Because, I always hear these folks say, well, but I love Israel. And I'm always like, look, I was a Jew who went to a Catholic school. I grew up in the middle of the country. I had friends who, like, their parents would say to them, your friend Jason seems great. It's a shame his family's going to hell. And they didn't mean it like, they weren't like trying to be mean. They were just like, that's what they believed. So my point is, when people are like, we love Israel, so we must love the Jews, I'm like, okay, but maybe you just want us to house sit for the rapture. And therefore and so I'm very worried about it. And I feel like if it's not something that we consistently call out and make not okay, we could be 2 years from a public opinion poll that says, like, do you think that like you're more American or you're less American if you're a Jew? And like 45% of Republicans say yes. Like, I don't think that is out of the question, right? That said, the reason I definitely think it's possible for a Jew to be president is because in my experience running in a state where there's not many Jews, and I won a statewide election, generally, if a person opposed me because I was a Jew or would never vote for me because I was a Jew, I generally found that was reason number 14 or 15 for that individual person to vote against me. So it's not like you're going to lose a lot of gettable votes, right? Like if a person is like, I will never vote for a Jew, they're probably never going to vote for a person with an F rating from the NRA. They're probably never going to vote. You know what I mean? Now there's some exceptions to that, but there, at least at this point, those exceptions are not numerous. But I am concerned about that. But also I'm concerned about it for the obvious reasons that have nothing to do with our politics and more to do with like, my family's safety, your family's safety, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Jason Kander. I hope everyone reads this book. And once again, just to remind everyone, it's called Invisible Storm, A Soldier's Memoir of Politics and PTSD. Thank you for coming on the broadcast. And to those watching, it's great to be with you on In the Spotlight, and I look forward to seeing you next time. I'm Abigail Pogrebin.